Well, I'll just briefly go over some developments in Europe, the European Union as an institution, not obviously since it started, but I would say in the last 11 years. And it hasn't been an easy decade, it's fair to say, for any institution. The problems for the EU began exactly 11 years ago when, with the rejection of what was supposed to be the constitution by French voters. A month later, the Dutch voters had rejected it too, and it briefly was a dead letter. Then it was brought back to life as the Lisbon Treaty that, in essentials, was the same set of changes as the Constitution. An extension of qualified majority voting, transfer of powers to central EU institutions, legal force for the Charter of Rights. But presented as a new treaty with amendments to existing treaties that required no referendums, crucially required no referendums for ratification. There was an exception with Ireland, etc., but they voted a second time and got the right result, and the Lisbon Treaty became a kind of de facto EU constitution under a different name. Now, stand back for a second and consider the implications of these early events. I think they demonstrate three characteristics of European Union policymaking as it has developed. That is uniformity, centralization, and a single permitted direction of travel. Uniformity, national vetoes are largely replaced by qualified majority voting. Harmonization of regulations was increased. Overall, the same institutions were to be imposed on all states, or all states made members, except for a few temporary exceptions, such as Britain and the euro. Centralization. Lip service is paid to the principle of subsidiarity in Lisbon, but in practice more powers are removed from national parliaments and governments to EU bodies in Brussels. Government thus becomes more remote from the voters, though not from pressure groups or corporations. And third, the principle of an ever closer union was upheld and advanced at Lisbon. If people voted against it, they have been essentially ignored or compelled to vote again until they gave the required answer. I think this sounds very much like the principle of historical inevitability applied to European Union. In other words, you're not allowed to reject ever closer union, and even if elections may come and go, they can't be allowed to halt that progress. These things, I think, are not good in themselves. They make Europe less democratically accountable and more remote, a Europe of politicians, NGOs, and corporations. And an inevitable result of that has been the alienation of the voters. The 2014 European elections, the last ones, had the lowest turnout since the first EU elections in 1979, just over 42%. One or two countries bucked this trend, and their turnout rose. The obvious countervailing example was Greece, where the voters had a very obvious interest in Europe, namely bailout money, and where the turnout rose to 60%. You can, if you wish, treat that as an encouraging sign. European election turnout is only the tip of the iceberg of alienation, though. Mainstream political parties associated with the European idea in Lisbon somehow look frozen and uninspired, winning mainly votes from people, the kind of voters who cast ballots in the same dutiful civic spirit as they give blood donations. Such parties are carried along by past loyalties from other times. That's why we call them legacy parties. Their victories may even increase voter alienation, as more voters drift to the so-called populist parties of left and right, that in the last decade have risen throughout Europe. France, where the National Front now gets a third of the vote and probably more in the next election. In Sweden, where the Swedish Democrats get between 20 and 25%. Denmark, where the Danish People's Party, a kind of moderate party devoted to protecting Denmark's welfare state against immigration. In Spain, with Podemos, in Greece with Syriza and Golden Dawn, in Italy with Beppe Grillo's party, in Hungary, of course, with Jobbik, in Britain with UKIP, in Scotland with the SNP, in Ireland with Sinn Féin. Now, some of these parties are respectable, I would say UKIP is. Some are tainted with racism and anti-Semitism, such as Jobbik or the Swedish Democrats. Some are tainted with murder, such as Sinn Féin in Ireland and Golden Dawn in Greece. But all of them are the result of popular resentments on the part of very large numbers of voters at the fact that the mainstream legacy parties offer them little choice on issues they consider important, including further European integration, but not confined to that. Voter disaffection, bad as it is less damaging on a daily basis than the distorting impact of remote bureaucratic politics on policy. In the very nature of things, if you move political decisions to remote bodies far from the voters, if you closet decision makers with corporate lobbyists and ideological NGOs like Greenpeace, if you ask them to be guided by the principle that all decisions should be infused with movement towards ever closer union, then you're going to get policies that are biased towards special interest coalitions, remote from voter wishes, very hard to change once they've been endorsed by the various players, and in the end, policies that are idealistic at best, unrealistic at most, and utopian at worst. Too many of the EU's policies forget that politics is the art of the practical, and that's the reason why we should be turning now to the reform of Europe and face up to the need for that. Some of these problems were caused directly, some of the problems that Europe faces were caused directly by its policies. And now the EU finds it hard to agree on a solution. The examples here obviously are the euro crisis, the migration crisis, and I would say too the energy crisis. When you look at the way the different nations in Europe divide on them, we see that Germany, Northern Europeans, the European Commission, would like to restore the borderless Schengen zone while distributing migrants throughout Europe on a quota basis. But other member states, particularly here, reject migrant quotas and are busy building fences. Chancellor Merkel's solution to this is a band-aid that will make matters worse, perhaps, by adding 70 million Turks to the number of people entitled to travel to EU states without a visa, while merely diverting migrants to other routes, as we have seen in the last few days. Though the euro crisis has currently gone quiet, it's going to return to the headlines in a month or so. When it does, it will expose the emerging fault line in Europe less on the single currency than on the larger conduct of European economic policy. All those EU states already in the euro do want to stay there, but they differ on what terms. To oversimplify, some want an extension of austerity, others want an end to austerity. The former, Germany, Northern Europeans, the Commission, support a fiscal union that would impose discipline on debtor nations. The latter, Mediterranean Europe, want a transfer union that would require creditor nations to help debtors through debt mutualization, direct subsidies, and so on. These divisions correspond roughly to conservative and left-wing parties across Europe. It's hard to see how such opposing perspectives are going to be reconciled. And that's because one half of Europe is afraid of being fleeced or ruined by the other half. Yet as long as they all stay in the single currency without a resolution of these different outlooks, the debtor nations cannot grow out of their exchange rate prison, and so the EU is likely to experience a long series of recessions, crises, and bailouts. Now, Europe's central institutions might once have ridden to the rescue, but their influence is much reduced by, as we have seen, the fact that fewer people vote in European elections, and those who do are moving towards these populist parties. Second, the response of the mainstream parties, the EPP and the Socialists in the European Assembly, their response to this growing voter alienation has been to coalesce against the populist threat. That robs a great deal more political debate of reality and popular interest. Both parties, in effect, agree on a policy of more Europe, which effectively means entrenching rather than reforming the euro, keeping migration policy as it is, and anything else in the European status quo is to be preserved. As resistance to Brussels mounts, Central Europe opposes its migrant policy, France's National Front campaigns to restore the franc, Mediterranean Europe attacks the austerity quality required to sustain their membership of the euro, and much else goes on. And then there are problems facing Europe that come from outside. What to do about Turkey's long-running application for membership, the Ukraine crisis, the Putin threat, Europe's long-range relationship with Russia. Minister, you just called for a more serious effort to be made to develop a strong Europe with this strong foreign and defense policy. But at the moment, the most that's been done here is the attempt to develop an independent EU defence capability at a time of general budgetary retrenchment and low defence spending. So, in effect, at the moment, that policy is a policy for either duplicating NATO or diverting resources from it. And it does not seem to be having a huge impact on Putin's aggression in the Ukraine. Now, if we need reform, what kind? Well, Margaret Thatcher, an earlier Prime Minister, answered that question in a speech in The Hague on Europe's political architecture. She concluded the structure of the EU bore the marks of its birth in post-war Europe, when bureaucracy was the conventional, top-down bureaucracy was the conventional wisdom about organisation. By the time she spoke, however, she thought this was yesterday's version of tomorrow. The EU in 1991 was degenerating into a cartel of governments increasingly engaged in collusion to raise the price of government, or keep up the price of government services. She argued instead that the EU, instead of cartelising itself, should be a market of governments. I quote, "The larger Europe grows, the more diverse must be the forms of cooperation it requires. This argues that Europe would have more success, less conflict, if it allowed different countries to adopt different levels of integration on different areas of policy as it suited them. Instead of more Europe for all, we could have more Europe for some and less Europe for others." And we obviously already have, as adaptations to unavoidable reality, I would say, some scattered examples of that. Denmark and the UK have an opt-out of the euro, and realistically many EU member states not yet in the euro will never join it, despite their treaty commitments to do so. The policy will be one, which I sometimes suspect is the Hungarian government's policy, of preparing to join the euro forever, a policy that may even outlast the currency itself. Other policies to achieve this kind of Europe might include dividing the euro into a southern and northern one to allow Mediterranean Europe to escape an exchange rate that prices its goods, services and tourism out of the market. A change from harmonizing regulations in Brussels to adopting the principle of mutual recognition, in which different member states accept each other's regulations and standards. And finally, rejecting policies to, as the Commission says, eliminate harmful tax competition, which means, of course, tax competition. Individually, each of these changes is modest. Taken together, they would encourage competition between member states as each put forward its own tax and regulation package to attract or retain investment and talented people. Now, people on the left, and there's conservatives who favour a major role for the state, decry this principle of jurisdictional competition as a race to the bottom of worst public services. But as the American writer James C. Bennett has argued in Brexit and Beyond, this is seeing things from the perspective of the state. Viewed from the perspective of the individual, jurisdictional competition is a race to the top, a competition between jurisdictions to provide the better environment for starting or expanding a business, pursuing a meaningful personal goal, or merely living free from the ability of other people to force their views of how you should conduct your life. Of course, it's also the case that a variable geometry Europe, a Europe à la carte, would allow federalist or socialist governments to offer better public services and to pursue their goals less hindered at a higher cost. A variable geometry Europe would enable those countries that seek a more centralized or regulated Europe to move ahead on their own, without, as now, the Brits walking slowly in front of the Franco-German locomotive waving a red flag. That freedom to experiment would also enable an end to the paralysis of uniformity that currently afflicts, in my view, Europe. I'll skip some more on those lines and say that at the moment, however, we have been living in a situation of institutional paralysis. Nothing like these reforms seemed to be on the agenda until about 3 years ago, the possibility of Brexit unexpectedly opened up the possibility of reform. The mere prospect that Britain and the EU might propose to negotiate changes began for a while to look as if it was going to be a catalyst for change in general. Enthusiasts, not for Brexit, but for the negotiations over Brexit, emerged in the oddest places. Last summer, for example, German conservatives arrived at Euro conferences talking of the Brexit negotiations as an opportunity to reform Europe along what they called responsible market lines, and of course to stop Mediterranean countries from raiding their treasuries. For a while in the German press, Britain ceased to be simply an anti-European deadbeat and became a valuable partner in seeking necessary fiscal reforms. Other EU states, inspired by a moderate Euroscepticism, were hopeful that the EU would lead a larger EU coalition against the EU's centralisation. For a moment, it looked as if Brexit might lead to breaking the euro paralysis, if not to Brexit. And that should have suited British Prime Minister David Cameron very well, since the UK government's policy under governments of both parties has long been one of market reform Europe-wide. It was under Tony Blair. If he had pressed at this point for substantial liberal decentralisation, including the return of some powers to national parliaments, he probably would not have succeeded in all his aims. That would be unrealistic, but he might have helped to swell an effective Euro reform movement across the continent. But for political reasons of his own, he seemingly decided to seek a quick agreement rather than a substantial one. He sought little, he got less. The momentum for EU reform died, and of course has been replaced by the quarrel over Brexit. What now? Well, the Brexit vote takes place in 10 weeks. If the Brits vote to leave, and as I said, the chances look 50-50, the UK government will then negotiate the terms of withdrawal over the next 2 years. I think those negotiations will be watched very carefully by other governments in Europe. Some may see the negotiating process as an example to follow, some as a threat to an already crisis-ridden euro. Many will want the mix of policy changes. They'll look at these policy changes and they will decide some of them might suit them. But the process will likely stimulate the appetite for reform everywhere in Europe. And even if Britain votes to remain, the mere fact of airing these arguments may have an impact as well. If this were to happen, if such a reform movement were to arise, it would convert many Eurosceptics into European reformers, but not all, and here's my final point. Since I'm the House Eurosceptic here, I would be evasive if I didn't turn to the question of whether Brexit could seriously happen and why. Well, let me give you the underlying psychology of the British here. What I now quote is from the late Roy Jenkins, perhaps the most influential politician who never became Prime Minister in the period 1960 to 1990. He was also the most fervent pro-European political leader in post-war British politics. He served in Brussels as a member of the European Commission. He won the Charlemagne Prize. He is almost a symbol of British Europeanism. Yet he was realistic enough to say, in 1999, after a quarter of a century of British membership, I quote, "There are only two coherent British attitudes to Europe. One is to participate fully and to endeavour to exercise as much influence and gain as much benefit as possible from the inside. The other is to recognise that Britain's history, national psychology and political culture may be such that we can never be anything but a foot-dragging and constantly complaining member, and that it would be better and produce less friction to accept this and to move towards an orderly and, if possible, reasonably amicable separation." I think the evidence is mounting, unfortunately, that the second option is the correct one. Europe has been the grumbling appendix of British politics. Membership of the European Union has never ceased to be a major issue in Britain, as it has in most European countries. The British plainly find the institutions of the European Union, from Roman law to Habsburg levels of regulations, to be uncomfortable, confining, contrary to their liberal instincts, and hostile to the kind of active participatory democracy which they developed and in which they feel comfortable. So they resist not only specific laws emanating from Europe or judgments from particular European courts, but even more so they resist the underlying concept of a European identity or patriotism. Now, I don't think this indicates hostility to the EU of a general kind. Most Eurosceptics I know actually favour the EU in a general sense and acknowledge its achievements in helping, along with NATO, to stabilise Central and Eastern Europe. That certainly is my view. It is understandable, they feel, that the French, the Germans, and their near neighbours should wish to move ahead to a more integrated state with its own currency, army, foreign policy, borders, and so on. That state will probably not be the existing 17 members of the Eurozone, but it might be. So what follows, what will happen in the event of a leave vote? Well, we will leave, presumably, over a period. What will happen in the event of a remain vote is, in fact, perhaps a little more interesting. This campaign is being fought, as everyone seems to acknowledge, by the Remain campaign on the basis of defeatism. The British simply can't hack it outside the EU. To attempt to do so is in a case of neo-imperial nostalgia and so on. If the Remain vote is won on that basis, on the basis of inculcating defeatism into the British, I think you can all foresee what happens then. An electorate that votes Remain, and which is already half ashamed of itself for doing so from motives of timidity and defeatism, suddenly discovers that the government has not told the truth and that more powers are being transferred from Britain to Brussels all the time. The government, under political pressure, announces it will resist those changes of power in Brussels. And suddenly, once again, the British, despite the vote, are the obstructionists of Europe who get in the way of every proposal for greater integration. The referendum will have solved nothing, and the British problem will re-emerge to plague European debates. Eventually, this forced marriage will become so stressful and unproductive that an amicable divorce will be reached, but probably, maybe not, this time around, unless the referendum surprises many people. So, I think there is a future for Britain and Europe. In any event, we live next door to each other. We have to cooperate. We can either cooperate in the present structure, which will be very difficult for us. We can cooperate in a reformed Europe fairly easily, and if we have to cooperate from separate institutional structures, I think we will learn to do so comparatively easily, but not without some difficult transitional changes. Thank you very much.